All right, so this is the graphic from the HiTCRiT, the heuristic for thinking about culturally responsive teaching. This is the sort of graphic representation that we came up with that we think, represents, or that actually does represent the four realms that make up the HiTCRiT. So those four realms are socio-emotional connections, style, texts, and institutional knowledge. So all of those things come into come into play in culturally responsive teaching, and they overlap and interact, and we can think about and plan for and address culturally responsive ways or um, ways of thinking about each of them. And you'll notice that when they all come together there and they're all overlapping, which is where we want to be, we call that the sweet spot. So that's where we want to be teaching as often as we can, as frequently as we can, is right there in the sweet spot. And again, the reason for taking these apart when really culturally responsive teaching is sort of this holistic thing that's going on in the classroom that involves the teacher and the students and the environment and everything that's going on. The reason for trying to break it apart and talk about these separately is not because they function on their own in a vacuum, okay? They clearly do not. But because we want to be able to identify the purposes behind what we're doing. So if I'm bringing in a text that I think is really relatable to my students, that's wonderful. But if I'm out here in this corner, not it's a circle, there's no corners, I know. If I'm out here in this far edge, right, of this ellipse here, math people, then I'm handing students something that they can relate to, something that they like, but what are they getting out of it, okay? But now if I'm overlapping that with some institutional knowledge, now we're getting a little bit closer to somewhere that we want to be. And I think this becomes a little bit more clear in some of the examples that I'm going to share with you, okay? So I'm going to break down each one and talk to you a little bit about each one, and then I'm going to occasionally, as I'm doing here, let somebody with a little bit more experience uh, and research under their belt talk about it as well. Okay, so texts. The big example that we like to use here is Rudine Bishop Sims. Dr. Sims came up with this notion of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors with children's lit. She's a children's lit scholar. And she said that children need to see themselves in books, that those are the mirrors, but they also need to see others and others' lives. So those are the windows. And then they need sliding glass doors where they can step in and feel the experiences of other people beyond their own realities. So that's something that we think about representation wise. We also think about relevance. Are the texts that we're bringing to our students relevant to their lives and experiences? And something that we thought was very important to stress in writing about the HiTCRiT is that we need to take a broad definition of texts. Okay, we don't just mean textbook. We don't even just mean books. Okay, so here's a quote from the text there. If I can get that little thing out of the way. Sorry. To be sure, texts can include familiar printed material typically seen in classrooms. However, they can also be other objects, films, arrangements of buildings, clothing styles, any object that can mediate meaning making. And this is where, for this class in particular, I think it's important for your disciplinary literacies to come into play. Historians, anthropologists, being able to read an anthropological site, okay, being able to read infographics becomes very important. In math, you have so much because math is its own language, and so you have to be able to read these signs and signals and all these different things. So we don't just mean a book, okay? Using this multimodal semiotic definition, text might include photos, YouTube clips, song lyrics, hyperlinks, and other digital formats, okay? And that's a quote from the article that you're going to read. But I'd like you to take a moment and listen to this clip and watch this clip from Dr. Sims, where she sort of describes mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors a little bit more eloquently than I could have done myself.
We need diverse books because we need books in which children can find themselves, see reflections of themselves. I wrote a piece, maybe 1990 it was published, which I called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And I think that's really why we children need to see themselves reflected, but books can also be windows, and so you can look through and see other worlds and see how they match up or don't match up to your own. But the sliding glass door allows you to enter that world as well. And so that's the reason that the diversity needs to go both ways. I mean, it's not just children who have been underrepresented and marginalized who need these books. It's also the children who always find their mirrors in the books and therefore get an exaggerated sense of their own self-worth and a false sense of what the world is like, because it's becoming more and more colorful and diverse as time goes on. So I think that's why.
So that clip of Dr. Sims to me has always been really powerful, in that her stress is on all of our students need the windows. Okay, some of our students are getting plenty of mirrors. I remember a professor, I'm sorry, a teacher that I had when I was in high school. The only bad grade I ever got, I got a D one semester in a history class because this man talked so fast and he would tell these fascinating, interesting stories, but he talked all about these wonderful things and you would listen to him and love him and adore him, but then that was nothing. His tests were straight out of the book. And I was not a kid who felt super compelled by history books. They bored me. Okay. I should have read them anyway. I could have studied. I knew this. But he was bringing in texts that were more relevant to our lives, but then that's not what he was assessing. And I remember one time in particular, he decided to bring in some very interesting texts, and he brought in clips from different classical composers, and he let us listen to them in class one time. He said, take notes. And then on the test, I'll let you listen to these clips again, and if you can identify the composer, then you get the points. To me, this was just an absolute wretched wake up call that I did not belong in gifted and talented classes, that I did not come from an educated enough family. And now mind you, my mother has a master's degree and my father has a doctorate. So I still felt completely like a fish out of water because we were not highbrow enough to listen to classical music at home. I had never heard these pieces, or if I had, it was on a commercial where they don't mention the composer. I'd never heard of these pieces, and I absolutely had no idea how to take notes about music because I took chorus class and not music class. So, I was completely out of my element, and I felt the way I think it was a good experience for me as a teacher because I think some of our students feel that way about the sort of cultural norms and references that we often use in traditional coursework are very familiar to a lot of people when they first walk through the school door, or they're familiar from home, they're familiar for a lot of different reasons, but for other students they're not. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind with text, and I think that Dr. Sims helps us keep that in mind in a really powerful way. Style in the HiTCRiT is another realm. These don't have to go in any order. Please keep that in mind. This is just the order of the slideshow. Style can refer to interaction styles or teaching style. Okay. Um, Traditional discourse interaction styles are very teacher lecture, so sage on the stage, we call it. You've got an I do, we do, you do sort of format that happens in a lot of classes. And what is very, very common is what we call the IRE sequence in education. That's inquiry, response, evaluation. That's when the teacher initiates an inquiry. So, what's 2 plus 2? And then there's a response, and the student says, "Oh, that's obviously 4, Miss Halliday." And I say, "Very good, Bob," right? So we move on. So that's inquiry, response, and evaluation. And my mentor, Dr. Foster, she said, if that feels authentic to you, if you feel like that's a real way of interacting, then go out on the street. Don't do it now, right, during Corona, but later, go out on the street and ask someone, "Pardon me, do you know what time it is?" And when they tell you, "Sure, it's 3:20," say, "Very good, you're correct," and walk away. And see how that person looks at you, right? We do not normally have conversations, share information, share ideas in order to be evaluated. It's not an authentic way of interacting. Now, sometimes it's an authentic way in some families for children to interact with their parents, but in other cultures it is not a common way for parents and children to interact, but it is very common in schools. So that's what we mean when we talk about interactive interaction styles. There are alternative ways to frame or to organize classroom discourse, okay? Instead of I do, we do, you do, try you do, y'all do, we do. Okay, so when we come together, you've already tried it on your own. You've tried it with a friend, and then we come together and we do it together as a group. Pardon my children, I know you can hear them. I tune them out. You'll learn to as well. Um, there's invitation and question. There's non-evaluative response with inductive learning. And inductive learning, I think, is a really fascinating topic. So I'm going to let you watch this little video um, in just a moment. But also, there's communities of learners, creating communities of learners. I'm a big proponent of this. And some of you may have heard Christopher Emdin. He wrote for White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and he pulls out a group of students from his classes very early on, and he calls these groups cogens, and they actually help generate the course norms and the modes of interaction, and and the content as well. They have some input in how content is delivered, what content is delivered, and um, and that kind of thing. He makes students sort of uh, responsible along with him for the learning and what goes on in the classroom. And that's really powerful style of interaction that privileges more community-based norms rather than authoritarian, I guess, based norms. So check out this awesome video on inductive learning.
Hi, this is Jennifer Gonzalez for Cult of Pedagogy. In this video, I'll show you how to teach an inductive learning lesson. To understand what inductive learning is, let's see how it compares to its opposite, deductive learning. In deductive instruction, the overall concept or rule is presented first. Then students work with examples to apply the concept or rule. In inductive instruction, that order is reversed. Students study examples of the content first, then they make generalizations, leading to an understanding of the rule. The order of deductive learning is rule to examples. In inductive, it's examples to rules. So instead of giving students the rule first, then having them practice it with examples, we would give them the examples first, then let them organize them until they discover the rule for themselves. One big advantage of inductive learning is that it uses the practice of identifying similarities and differences, which research has shown to be one of the most effective ways people learn. It also requires students to think on higher levels, especially that hard-to-reach analyzing level, because students really have to determine what information is and is not relevant. And although inductive learning has a lot of different names and structures, we're just going to look at a very simple type of lesson you can use without a lot of preparation. This is Gina, a middle school science teacher. Gina is about to begin a unit that addresses the next generation science standards concerning natural selection and adaptations. Eventually, Gina's students will have to be able to demonstrate complex levels of understanding about things like hereditary traits and how species have changed over time. But before they can do that, Gina wants them to have a basic understanding of how different species of animals are grouped by traits. Now, she could just go about this in a straightforward way by showing them the basic taxonomy that organizes animals, and then having students do some sort of work that applies the concepts she just taught them. Instead, Gina is going to have her students learn about these groupings by exploring the animals and their traits first to see what conclusions they can come up with. Step 1 of inductive learning is to provide students with examples of the content. Now, I'm calling these examples, but you can also fill in this blank with keywords from the content, sample problems such as in a math class, or scenarios in a lesson about history, or life skills, artifacts in a science, technology, or history lesson, images that illustrate certain phenomena or techniques, or sets of data.
Okay, so I think that's a really powerful video about inductive learning. And the reason that I share it with you is because I want you to understand that when we talk about style with the HiTCRiT, I certainly don't just mean that you need to try to use your students' slang or use their language varieties. If you are not a natural speaker of your students' language, and always going to be a youth culture, even when you get out there and you're a 22-year-old teacher, you'll find you've already lost sight of some of the language that your students use. If you're like me and you're more non-traditional, there's absolutely a gap there. So I mean, when I talk about style, we do not have to try to emulate something that is not natural to us. There are different ways dis, to sort of rethink and disrupt traditional interaction styles rather than just how we talk and the way that we behave. Although those are important and can be powerful too if we leverage them appropriately. Now I'm going to stop here. I was going to just do two parts, but this video is already getting a little long because of the other embedded videos. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to do a part 3. Okay. Um, so more in just a moment.